message from our sponsor, the Royal Literary Fund.
Are you a professional writer struggling with financial difficulties? The Royal Literary Fund is here to support you. At the RLF, we believe that every writer deserves a chance to thrive, no matter what life throws your way. We offer a variety of hardship grants tailored to help professional writers in need, whether it's short-term relief or ongoing support. Perhaps you're dealing with an unexpected expense, a drop in income, or facing challenges that make writing difficult, such as illness, disability, or now relying on your pension. If you're eligible, our grants team will walk you through our discreet and confidential application process, ensuring you receive the support you need. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and inquire today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself speak with the novelist Sarah Perry.
We spoke to Sarah about growing up in a strict Baptist household, about her breakout success with the Essex Serpent, and about her latest novel, Enlightenment.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it.
Sarah, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's excellent to have you on the show. Can we start with your latest novel, Enlightenment, and in particular the point of departure for the novel and the experience or the memory that you had, the false memory that you had of seeing Halley's Comet with your father?
Yeah, it's of all the novels I've had, it's the one that's had the most tricky gestation period because it took 6 years to write and 4 or 5 drafts to arrive at the form and the tone and the story that I wanted to tell. But it really began when I was very young. I was brought up by someone who taught maths and someone who was a physicist or a material scientist, but they were also very religious and six-day creationists. So I had this strange childhood where the pursuit of science and the dignity of science and the examination of the material world was allied to wonder and to faith. And my dad in particular was really excited about Halley's Comet coming around in 1986. And all my life I've carried this really vivid memory of seeing Halley's Comet with my dad. And I have a tattoo of Halley's Comet and have been fascinated by it all my life. And it turned out to be a false memory. Nobody saw Halley's Comet. I mean, you maybe saw it in the Atacama Desert with a telescope, but you definitely didn't see it in Chelmsford with the naked eye. And so I was already working on a book about love and faith and memory, and it helped me fixate on this idea of kind of mistaken love and what happens when you think that you have found something that you perhaps haven't. Like, does that negate the whole experience? Does it make you foolish, or is it something wonderful?
And could you tell us about Thomas Hart, both in the context of this novel and how you go about conceiving your characters? So he's a man of 50, but has this kind of double life, raised in a very strict Baptist chapel, but also a gay man who lives that part of his life in London as an out gay man and a writer. Tell us about where he came from and how you go about building people.
So I just create characters as fictional devices, right? I don't usually have any kind of emotional attachment to them at all. I don't write from character first. I write from idea first and story first. So all of my characters are devices for me to be able to move the plot around and examine different things. And so if you want to write a novel about somebody moving out of faith towards kind of the sciences, then that means it's a certain kind of person who perhaps is trapped between two worlds and is looking for a way of escape and is looking for a new way of wonder. So I began to conceive the idea of this man who perhaps shared my childhood and then also shared my questing away from sort of a very strict religious faith into the sciences and into physics. And then people are always really disappointed when I tell them this, but this is a podcast about writing, so I'm going to be really truthful. I really wanted there to be a friendship with a young girl in the church, right? Because I wanted him to be a bridge between this closed world of the church and everything that's out in the world, the music, sex, men, all of that kind of exciting stuff. But we have been trained by contemporary fiction to be looking out for child abuse as a plot point from 100 paces, which I think is really awful. It's not a cute plot device. It's something harrowing and terrible. And so in order for me to make sure the reader was very clear that they did not have to spend this entire novel waiting for Thomas Hart to be a pervert, I made him gay because I just, I wasn't going to have any reader of mine just waiting for the moment that a man's hand goes up a girl's skirt. Right? It's just not going to be something that I do. And then when I understood his sexuality, that gave like more depth to his character, and it gave more reason behind his ambivalence about the church. And so then he kind of ran away from me, and he became really the only character that I've ever felt very emotionally attached to.
That's so interesting as the genesis of that character. I mean, in terms of using characters as devices, you allude to the kind of the fact that the sexuality helped unlock a part of the story that you wanted to talk about. But how else do you kind of add that depth and those details to characters so that they go beyond just pure devices to kind of living, breathing characters in your story?
I think, honestly, and I think most novelists would probably concede this if pressed, you just invest them with yourself, right? So there's that hoary old truth that you only write what you know, which is such a stupid thing to say, because of course you can only write what you know. I mean, but that's the only thing you can possibly do. You only have this consciousness and this memory and this philosophy, however you kind of pin it down. So what happens with me in my writing is that gradually each character becomes invested with facets of myself that are sort of most like them. And we're all so complex, and we all have so many selves, right? Who you are with your family will not be who you are professionally, will not be who you are on a night out when you feel really great and you're looking your best. So we all do it. But I think what novelists do is really, really, really dig very deeply into all of those selves that we carry around with us, and amplify those characteristics and then hand them over to their characters. So I would say every character that I've ever written is a self of mine. Even if they only contain like the tiniest part of my nature, there will be something of my nature in them that I then kind of like massively amplify.
Do you find that you're taking more out of yourself than you are out of other people who you know or see in real life? I mean, a classic thing that novelists often say is that their characters are not based on real people, but are based on a kind of amalgam of real people they know,
Yeah.
so taking different features. But
Yeah.
do you feel that you're taking more internally than externally at that point?
I think so, because we have no choice, right? So even if I said to myself, I'm writing about my friend Jim specifically, it's me looking at him. There's no view from nowhere. You can't say I'm taking something from this person, because what you observe about them and what you understand about them is all coming from yourself anyway. So it's, although absolutely I observe other people and I watch them and I might notice their voice patterns, I'm also in that observation. So I've altered them merely by the act of observation, not to immediately return to theoretical physics like I always do. So there's no view from nowhere. And I think you can never write some kind of like objective version of somebody that you know, because it's you that's knowing them. Even history is not, written in a totally even-handed way. It's written by someone observing it through their own eyes.
And in the novel, Thomas writes about a comet, and that kind of sets off this chain of events and this increasing interest in astronomy. And that is something that you kind of drew again on your own experience, particularly during lockdown. Is that right?
Yeah. So I'd had this idea for the book for a couple of years, and had I'm always writing about faith and science, right? This is my preoccupation. It's my kind of area of specific area of interest, and I'd written about medical sciences before. And then I began to be more and more interested in astronomy and astronomy's potential in the novel. And then so I decided to buy myself a telescope. So literally about 2 weeks before lockdown, I happened to go out and buy a very, very good telescope. So I don't mean like a cute little desktop vintage thing. It's a massive 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain with a GPS system, right? So it's absolutely huge and very sophisticated. And then the world stopped, and industry stopped, and air travel stopped, and we had the best spring ever. So the skies are very clear. So I had a pandemic of astronomical observations that made me, I'd always been very interested in astronomy, but it made me more and more and more deeply interested in it. And then studying Kepler, studying the Enlightenment astronomical physicists, and studying Carlo Rovelli and theoretical physics. And so Thomas's nature and his journey into physics grew with mine. So this is one of the things that I mean about how you can't ever escape yourself in your novels, especially if you write something over the course of 6 years. You're not the person at the end when you're doing your copy edits as you were at the beginning, or you certainly shouldn't be anyway. So yeah, it was a really interesting conflation of events that, there was nothing else to do. I was writing a book that was on astronomy, and I happened to have a telescope, and the nights were extraordinary.
I saw you'd mentioned elsewhere that the thing that you find with astronomy and this other interesting science is that you come up against the maths, right? That is at one point that you can engage with it in terms of the history and the personalities and things like that. And I thought you had this comment about talking with a theoretical physicist, and he loves music but can't play music. I mean, how big a thing is? Do you feel that there is a part of this that remains inaccessible just because it is so quantitative, and is that an issue when writing about it?
Yeah, and if I wanted to, so one of the reasons I didn't make Thomas a theoretical physicist was because I could never hope to speak through the voice of somebody who knew that much about physics. So he had to be an amateur like me, in the proper sense of amat, to love. So he's a lover of physics, I'm a lover of physics, and there will always be a block. So your basic maths I can understand. So Kepler's law regarding planetary motion, the semi-major axis sweeps out equal areas in equal time. This is sub-A level stuff. So the simple mathematical laws that govern planetary orbits and that sort of thing I can get to. But theoretical physics and that kind of mathematics is beyond me. And yeah, Carlo Rovelli, the Italian writer physicist, said to me, you need to imagine that you're somebody who loves music but can't read a score. You still love music and you know music and you understand music. You're just not reading the score, which is one of the most generous and sort of helpful things anyone's ever said to me, I think.
We interviewed Kevin Barry, and I think he had a similar thing of he didn't want to do research about horses, so he had just had his characters avoid horses in his Western entirely.
Excellent. Yeah.
Just a different workaround.
I think it wasn't it that he just made him really bad with horses. I think that was the
okay.
There was something with horses.
There was definitely a horse thing. Yeah.
I wondered, Sarah, how you think about writing about wonder and the sublime. I mean, is it a risk of it sounding kind of glib or a little bit naff, and how you avoid doing that?
Oh yeah, of course. And I think writing should be risky. I'm a little bit sick of careful writing, man. I really am. Like, keep it brief and spare, and try not to use too much fuck off. Sorry, you did say I could swear. It really, really, really torments me with its kind of impecunious, namby-pamby, frightened, risk-free approach to writing. Don't frighten the horses. Don't write a sentence that has like more than 3 clauses in it. Try not to use speech marks. Books should disappear. Ideally it shouldn't exist. Ideally it should just be a sort of whisper that goes past you. It's not real, right? A novel is not real. It doesn't have to pretend to be real. It doesn't have to pretend to exactly mimic the way people speak. It is an artifact. It's a work of art. It exists because somebody made it. And so I would always err on the side of risk. I would rather write a kind of noble failure of a book that plays with language, that plays with the ecstatic capacities for the rhythm and the cadences of language, that really excavates the extraordinary wealth of imagery and language and metaphor that we have, and risks seeming, twee or sentimental, then spend my whole life kind of starving my writing down to this kind of like one-size-fits-all, frictionless idea of what modern prose should be like. And I feel like I've been fighting against that idea of good prose since I did my MA, where the kind of conception is that you should keep it all very spare and plain and all the rest of it. And still, like 20 years later, it's still something that people talk about as if, the ideal novel just kind of doesn't exist. It's just not there. And I reviewed Sean Hewitt's new novel for The Guardian at the weekend. And there are writers like Sean Hewitt that I receive with such gratitude because they seem to me to be working in that same mode of kind of ecstatic observation and a willingness to risk somebody saying, I can't believe you described a flower. and I think you get to the stage where you've become so old-fashioned that you've become something new, and that's what I'm hoping to keep doing. So you're absolutely right. It is a risk. And I'm kind of quite happy. Sarah Hall, who's a good friend of mine, talks about her writing as being strong meat. And whenever we meet up and talk about work, we say we're going to be strong meat, you know, and some people are going to want to spit it out, and that's fine. But I'd rather be strong meat than, you know, a Dairy Lee triangle. Sorry, that was a rant, wasn't it?
That's excellent. No, don't worry. Never apologise for rants on this show.
Can we roll back a little bit now, but also sort of not roll back and talk about how your upbringing shaped both this novel and your other work? So you grew up in a strict Baptist household in Essex. So obviously religion, something you were kind of steeped in. Tell us about that, and then, you know, tell us about how you think that kind of runs through to where you are today.
I think for a lot of people it would have been subpar, right? That kind of upbringing. But I have never... All I've wanted all my life is to sit indoors, play the piano, read a Thomas Hardy novel, and then write. So if you have an upbringing where those are the occupations available to you, then you kind of flourish. In some ways, I guess it was difficult. You know, I've never felt normal. I've never felt quite at home in the world. I'm 45 now, but for many, many years, pop culture references just kind of flew by me, and I was identifiably odd in the way that I dressed, and the fact that I didn't really understand what people were talking about when they talked about kind of television or something. But looking back, what I see that it gave me was the idea that storytelling can and should cover all bases, right? So if you take the King James Bible, which was what I was brought up on as just an artifact, right? It's just a work of art. If we just examine it from that point of view, what you have is the most sublime achievement in English prose. It's just sort of like gradually, generally accepted to be like the apex of English prose, conveying really extraordinary, dangerous, mad, strange philosophical ideas through really thrilling storytelling. And I think it gave me this idea that was the height of what a human being could achieve, to tell stories that convey some vast meaning, disturbing meaning, ecstatic meaning in very beautiful prose. And so I think that's probably the main thing that has stayed with me. It made me think, because from the age of 5 or 6, I was already thinking about ethics, philosophy, eternity, and but it also gave me access to this kind of vast world of beauty and music.
I think with other authors we've had on the show who also had an upbringing that was very steeped in religion, and particularly the Bible, they said that the rhythms of the King James's Bible also kind of subtly, or maybe not subtly, infused their prose. Do you think that's something that has happened with your writing as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things that is easy to forget about Wycliffe and Tyndale is that their intention for translating the Bible into English was political. So it's a political text. The idea was that rather than severing the working classes and the lower classes from the establishment who could read the Bible in Latin and tell them what to think, they would have access to it in their own language and in a way that was easy to memorise. So it was Tyndale, I think, who said he would translate the Bible into English so that even the ploughboy would be able to understand it. So it gives you this idea of the power of language politically, and of how potentially dangerous, disruptive and radical it is to have access to these texts, but also that it could be written in a way that is very easy to memorise. And that just taps into thousands of years of culture of storytelling handed down orally. You know, Homer and you know, those great texts were intended to be shared mouth to ear, so to speak.
Can you tell us about reading Kazuo Ishiguro, reading The Remains of the Day when you were 17? You've said that fixed your path, that novels became something to which I wanted to devote my life. Tell us about that.
I think until I did A-level English, I was probably more besotted with poetry than with prose. I read a huge number of novels all through my youth, but they seemed to belong to like a vanished age. And I remember being really obsessed with Tennyson, and it's around here somewhere. I always keep near to hand my leather-bound Everyman Tennyson book that I bought when I was about 14, and sort of obsessively read Tennyson. And I think I tried to write some sort of dismal poetry, and I didn't know how I could live in a modern world with my love of literature, because it seemed to me to be something behind me and not ahead of me. And then we were set The Remains of the Day as an A-level set text, and it seemed to indicate that actually it wasn't something that used to happen, it was something that was still happening. Prose so exquisitely and carefully worked as to operate like a beautiful piece of carpentry. Very, very, very deep and profound feeling and very serious ideas. And I just remember holding this. I can even remember that the book had this curious, almost rubber-like matte black cover. And I remember like holding it against my cheek because it was really tactile and thinking, he's alive now. He's actually alive now. I'm alive at the same time as this man. And it just made me think, oh, it's happening now. It's now. It's still there. There's still this extraordinary kind of pantheon of writers. And what's really important about that book is that my father never reads fiction, but my mother read a lot of fiction, but she never read contemporary fiction. Never, ever. And I lent her The Remains of the Day, and it had a very similar effect on her, you know, because I think she had this sort of very strict Baptist idea that contemporary culture was all something to be kept away from. And then she read Ishiguro and she was completely blown away by it. So it's kind of a sacred text for me.
Given that story had kind of alighted your passion for novels and literature, I mean, you went off to study English literature at university. Presumably that was a lot of past texts rather than contemporary ones.
I studied at Anglia Ruskin, so because it was Anglia Polytechnic at the time, and they had a really, really forward-thinking, and they still do, like contemporary literature course. So you wouldn't be reading like Spenser's The Fairy Queen and well, you would be reading some Chaucer, but we would do things like have modules where you would be reading texts written by somebody who had come along to the university that afternoon to do a reading alongside, much more kind of reverently held texts. So that was a kind of useful like stepping on point of introducing me to more contemporary stuff. And that's where I first encountered the Gothic as well, because it was taught in this really vital way where you would be reading Matthew Lewis alongside Angela Carter, and it really showed me this kind of continuum of standing on giants' shoulders, and that like maybe I could clamber up one day too.
And then what took you into the civil service after you finished university?
Oh, poverty, love. I mean, I was never one of these writers whose godmother was going to give them a flat in Bristol where they could write. Do you know what I mean? I had to earn a living. So I just, no one was ever going to give me any money. I've worked since I was 16. So, this is not something that's talked about enough, is the access to the arts is cut off to people who are just from a really ordinary background who have to earn a living. And I encounter so many people who don't understand the privileges that they've had, even to just be able to work part-time. I couldn't work part-time. A part-time wage in a coffee shop enabling you to work on your writing craft does not pay the rent. So I had to get a proper job and I had to grow up. So I went straight into the civil service. And it's quite often people speak to me about my writing career and they ask how many jobs that I've had. And I've had several, like proper boring 9-to-5 full-time office jobs. And they're always gobsmacked. And it makes me really sad because it makes me realise how rare it is for somebody to just have to get a job. Because no one's going to fund their little novel. And I'm glad, because it meant that I lived an ordinary life and met loads of different people and was not immediately kind of shut off in an ivory tower where all I did was kind of, meet other writers or other artists. I was just, I'm very dull.
I don't think it's dull. But while you were doing those 9-to-5 jobs, were you still writing in the evening and still wanted to pursue that? Or was that came later?
No. Didn't write at all. I wrote a little bit during my BA at Anglia Ruskin. There was a module where we had to write one short story, and that was the only fiction that I wrote until I was in my late 20s and did the masters. So I was living this life, which I know lots of people will recognise, and I hope there are listeners who are really paying attention to this. You can be somebody who was born to write, really born to write, and never write a word for a very long time, because that was what I was like. Working 9-to-5 in a basement office on, employment policy for Yvette Cooper is not conducive to going off and writing these kind of ecstatic flights of fancy. And that doesn't mean that I didn't want to write or that I wasn't going to become a writer. It just meant that it felt like a lost continent. It wasn't something that I had anything to do with. And And so I didn't start writing fiction until I was 26 and started my MA.
And then when you were 27, you left the church. And you said that if you'd stayed in the church, you would not have been able to be a novelist. So tell us about that period of time, about doing the MA and leaving the church. And I was also interested to think, given your, as you said, your religious upbringing still kind of in some ways suffuses your work. What are your relationships now like with your parents and people who remained in that environment?
Well, one of the things that I think is really important for me to convey is that I wasn't brought up in a cult. So a cult will excommunicate people who leave, right? You're really over a barrel. They've got you there by kind of emotional blackmail, often by financial blackmail, and you leave and you never see anyone again. That's not how I was brought up. So my relationship with my parents never changed. I'm always glad to see anybody who was at that church. I remain very fond of them. I have no bitterness or contempt, but I certainly couldn't worship in any of those places with a clear conscience. So when I do go to church, it tends to be at Norwich Cathedral, and not very regularly. And I suppose when I say I couldn't write whilst being in that church, I mean specifically that type of church. I don't mean that I couldn't write and have a faith. I still have faith. But the kind of church that I was brought up in and then went to in my 20s examined your behaviour all of the time. Did you miss a prayer meeting? Did you fail? I can remember once Robert and my husband and I were in a car crash, not a serious one, we just had whiplash. But 2 people came up to us afterwards and said, did you pray for safety before the car journey? So everything that you did was kind of examined from that lens. And it would have meant that every word I wrote, I would have been writing with 6 deacons and a pastor behind my shoulder. And it's just not possible. It's not possible.
And you mentioned as well, you went off to do an MA in creative writing, and that there was this emphasis on spare, kind of limpid writing, and your sensibility was considered a little bit more Victorian. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what the good things and the bad things of doing that MA were?
Well, the main good thing about that MA was that it made me write a novel. So if you're somebody who is from a background where I don't think I knew what a literary agent was until halfway through my MA. I'd never met a writer. First time I met a writer was when I went to my first MA session. I didn't know anyone who was in the arts at all. I knew people who worked for British Telecom or who were hospital porters or who were secretaries, didn't know anyone in the arts at all. And it makes the idea of writing a book seem bizarre and remote. You don't have permission to do it because it's not something that your godmother does. It's not something that your uncle did once. It's something that other mostly dead people do. So the main reason that I'm grateful for the MA was because it gave me permission to sit down and write a book. And I think whatever happens to somebody during an MA, and it's often very grueling and it can be very depressing and very testing of your patience and your self-esteem, it does make you write. And that is the great thing about MA study, is that you have a deadline and therefore you have to go and do some writing. So if you're someone like me who... all my life, I have felt the only reason for me to continue to draw breath is to write. That's what I'm here for. And yet I was never doing it because there was no permission, there was no example. The MA does that for you. And that's why I think there's such a kind of... they can be like a levelling force.
This week's episode is brought to you by Readsy, the world's top marketplace for publishing professionals.
Whether you're writing your first book or your 5th, Readsy can help you take a real step into the world of publishing.
On their site, you'll find professional editors who have worked on everything from best-selling children's books to presidential memoirs and Booker-winning novels.
You can hire them as book coaches to guide you through the writing process, get detailed developmental notes to shape your next draft, or bring in a top-tier copy editor to polish your prose.
Browse through thousands of hand-picked editors from around the world, put together your shortlist, and start getting quotes today.
And, for listeners of Always Take Notes, Readsy is offering $50 off your first collaboration when you sign up at readsy.com/loves/notes.
That's reedsy.com/loves/notes.
Sign up today and give your book the best chance at success. Can we talk now about After Me Comes the Flood? And we always like on the podcast to get guests to really go into the weeds with particularly their first published book, of how it worked in terms of agents, publishers, things like that. And we saw it was turned down by 19 different publishers. And also we're interested in the role of Hannah Westland, because we've had her previously on the show as well. So take us through all of the twists and turns of that story.
It's such an amazing story that I'm still kind of gobsmacked when I think about it. So the MA and the PhD, I then went on to do the PhD. So the novel was written also during the PhD. And I was never somebody who my fellow students or my tutors would have picked as being likely to be successful, or even published, I don't think, because I was writing so far away from what was generally considered to be what people want from books. And so I produced this novel to nobody's delight on the PhD, I think. And then I sent it off, and I chose Hannah Westland, who at the time was an agent at Rogers, Coleridge and White, because Rogers, Coleridge and White represented some people that I'd heard of, and because she was young. And I thought it would be nice to have a young agent, someone that I could kind of grow up with. And I sent the novel off with very little expectation, because, I hadn't really been encouraged to think that, much would come of my work. And she phoned me back within 24 hours of receiving the submission and said, come in. And I was signed immediately. Like, it was quite really head spinning. And I allowed myself this feeling that, after all these years and after all these disappointments and after constantly being told that nobody wants this sort of work, at the age of 31, I've signed with Rogers, Coleridge and White within days of my first submission. And she edited the book with me, because she's a superb editor, and then she sent the book out and nobody wanted it. And I think it's probably the most unhappy I've ever been in my life, because if the rejections had been, she can't write, this is a bad book, no thank you, I would have understood. But the rejections were, this is extraordinary, it haunted me for days, I've never read anything like it, no thank you. And I just thought, I actually don't know how to operate if producing work that is highly original and haunts someone for days is unpublishable. So I think I just entered some kind of fugue state, thinking, I'll never be published. And months went by, and eventually I went on holiday and came back and turned my phone back on, and there was a note from Hannah saying that she was leaving the agency, which meant that, the one person in the whole of British publishing who thought I was any cop was leaving. So I thought, well, that's it then, isn't it? I'm just going to have to go and be a civil servant for the rest of my life. And she took me for a pint and told me that she was leaving to be the publisher at Serpent's Tail, and that she was going to publish my book. And so after all of those rejections, my agent became my publisher, which is highly unusual. And then there was a 22-month wait for publication, which was agonising, because by then I'd finished my PhD, I wasn't writing anymore. I was running a committee of barristers for the Council of the Inns of Court. So once again, the world of literature and the only thing I've ever loved was so far away and so remote. And then as it came up to publication, you'll know this from working in the industry, a debut can be a quite splashy thing, right? So every year the Observer has their 15 or whatever debut novelists to watch. There'll be roundups in all the newspapers. These are the really big debuts of the year. Absolutely no publicity at all for After Me Comes the Flood. Nothing. Tumbleweed. Nobody was interested. I think there were a couple of bloggers that liked the look of it, but I watched quite a few people I know be selected for all of these kind of debut novelist showcases. And once again, after all of those rejections and all of the waiting, nobody wanted my work. So I woke up on publication day, and bear in mind, all I've ever wanted all my life is to be a writer. I was 34. I woke up on publication day and I can remember it as clear as day. I opened my laptop and I put my quilt over my head, and I felt no joy at all. Like, what was the point? What's the point of writing a book if no one even knows it's out? And I opened Twitter and I said to my husband, I suppose I better tweet. I've got a book out today, not that anyone gives a shit. And I happened to be following the Guardian Review account. And as I was on Twitter, the Guardian Review scrolled up and the headline was, something like extraordinary, unforgettable debut novel. And it was Book of the Week for The Guardian, and it had been reviewed by John Burnside, saying, this is astounding, it's like Kafka, it's like Chekhov. And by the end of the week, all of the newspapers were couriering proof copies across to their offices so it could be reviewed. And it had blanket 5-star reviews. And then, I was able to pay off my quite heavy debts within about 4 months. And that was that. It was just amazing. It was completely extraordinary.
What do you think that experience reveals about the publishing industry, both in terms of the, accepting, as you say, kind of more original or experimental type fiction, and also about reviewers and the kind of hype that certain books generate?
It's so interesting, isn't it? And I think it's a publishing industry, and everybody needs to remember that. And I don't look back and feel any anger at all, because it's an industry, and publishers are not charities. They're not there to make the art scene flourish. They have to pay the wages of the people that they employ and ideally turn a profit so that they can then publish the next book. And I'm still, after all of these years, quite surprised at my sales. It's like, I don't know that I would have expected people to want to read about, religion and the Gothic and science in quite so many numbers. But I think it does show particularly the hype around certain types of debut can be quite dangerous. So I've had a very easy time because nobody ever told me I was going to be a star, ever. So I just worked and I wrote, and then slowly I was lucky enough to find my readers and to find the critical response that has helped me so much. What I think is really dangerous is the annual crowning of half a dozen, often quite young people, who are then fated, and they have a huge marketing budget behind them for like 1 year, and then that's that. And I've seen it happen over and over and over again, and I don't know how I would have recovered from that. So I've often said, both to Hannah and to my agent now, I think it's absolutely perfect to have the experience that I had, which is that it's just the work. You're probably not going to make a living out of this, and that's absolutely fine. Find your voice. Doesn't matter if everyone thinks it's old-fashioned or strange or too worked or too Gothic. Work, just work, make your work good. And then I've been fortunate enough to find my readers. The reverse, which is that I'm going to make you a star, darling. and front cover of The Observer, Voices to Watch, immediate Sunday Times bestseller because of a massive marketing campaign. And then you write your next book, but your publisher is already misty-eyed about the next debut. And I think that's potentially really painful. Well, I know it is. I've seen it.
Could we talk then about following it up? So 2016, The Essex Serpent started by this single throwaway comment by your husband. I mean, given that unexpected success, what was the second album like, as it were?
I will never really know what that would be like, because that was also when I became very ill. So the two things are very tied up with each other. So exactly the time that we began early publicity for The Essex Serpent, I began to experience chronic pain and chronic fatigue. And then just before publication, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. And then during publication, I had to have emergency surgery on my spine, and I had a terrible 3rd-degree burn. And so the enormous and very surprising to me success of The Essex Serpent comes with this kind of counterbalance, like the operations of a mechanical clock, right? So there was this extraordinary success, my first ever inkling that I might own my own home. I'd assumed that I would never be able to own a home, and that became possible. But it came alongside savage physical suffering and the acceptance of an incurable disease. And so the honest answer is that I'll never really know what it was like, because it wasn't a period of sort of unalloyed excitement and success. It came at the same time as very, very serious kind of physical suffering. So, but at the same time, it was very, it was incredibly joyful and surprising, I would say. Yeah.
So did the diagnosis and the pain start while you were writing The Essex Serpent, or as
No.
it was being published?
After, yeah, as it was being published. And so Melmoth was written during a period of very, very intense suffering. And it's quite interesting talking to the marketing director for Serpent's Tail at the time. She remembers me walking with her around bookshops to hand over proofs of The Essex Serpent, and me just stopping in the street and being really confused and saying, I hurt all over, I don't understand. And she was like, have you sprained your ankle? I said, no, it's just it's like my bones hurt. And that's when it began. Yeah. So I had this really curious experience where you suddenly realise that you are being perceived by a vast number of people who don't know you at all and are perceiving you through the filter of the press. So I was in the press a good deal for that year, and was very fortunate with various nominations and various things happening. And the external perception was very, very different from what was actually going on, because I'm hard as nails, right? So I would turn up to events like ripped to the tits on opioids and like barely able to walk, and would put on a show, and then would like have to get into a cab and lie flat because I was incapable of sitting down, and then would just be out of it for days. And then I would pull myself together and go out again. And so I began to realise that it's possible to live this curious kind of double existence where people have absolutely no idea what's kind of really going on. And actually, one of the most upsetting moments of my whole life was when I was at the British Book Awards, where I won Novel of the Year and Book of the Year, and I was on an enormous amount of painkillers, and had to change a burn dressing and still had stitches in my spine. And I was on gabapentin, which is a nerve painkiller that can make you unsteady on your feet. And I walked slightly unsteadily as I was going up to the stage, and I overheard someone say to somebody else, she's already drunk. And I just remember thinking, like, I would never ever be like drunk at an industry event. It's inconceivable to me. But you can't just take the microphone and say, actually, just to let everybody know I'm staggering because I'm in agony. And it was a really sobering lesson in that success is kind of a chalice of dubious quality in some ways, because you can't correct what everyone thinks of you. You have to just let them think it is fine.
So thank you for being so candid about that. Another question we always ask to novelists is how they go about constructing their stories. So whether they plan in advance or they just kind of dive in and follow their nose or their subconscious. Which of those, when we understand there's a whole spectrum in between, but which of those two poles do you hew to? And maybe telling us in the context of the Essex Serpent or in Melmoth, how you go about putting it all together.
So absolutely planning first, but in a very strange way. So I don't have any notebooks. I don't keep notes. I've kept notes more for enlightenment because of the physics. So I needed to kind of note down fact. But I don't do any kind of charts or timelines or anything along those lines. I think and I think and I think and I recite and I memorise until the entire thing is in my head. So it ends up feeling like it already exists and it's a book that I've read a couple of times and that I could tell you about. And then I sit down and write it, and I begin at the beginning and I write through to the end. Doesn't always work. So with Enlightenment, the first go didn't work and I had to kind of go over it again. But largely speaking, it's this moment of its existence in my head in its entirety. And quite often I can recite the opening. And then once I know that I have the opening verbatim in my mind, I'll then sit down, type up what I have verbatim, and then move on from there.
We're sort of jumping around a bit here, but to return to the Essex Serpent, it was a hit when it was published. It was sort of a word of mouth hit, sold hundreds of thousands of copies in hardback alone. Can you kind of put your finger on what it was about the story and Cora Seaborn that kind of really resonated with readers?
I hope that it's because it had sort of something for everybody. And that's the kind of bottled lightning, right? So if you are a fan of the Gothic, you could read The Essex Serpent or any of my books. If you like historical fiction, you could read The Essex Serpent. If you just like literary fiction and you're interested in somebody who's interested in prose, you could read The Essex Serpent. If you're interested in the sciences, you could read The Essex Serpent. If you're interested in religion. So I think it was that whenever I meet readers now of The Essex Serpent, I realise how it is a different book to different people. So for some people, it's the kind of slight spookiness that they love because they love ghostly stories. For some people, they just love Victoriana and it's late Victorian and they love that. And I guess it just happened to arrive at a time when there hadn't been much Gothic and there hadn't been that kind of neo-Gothic, neo-Victoriana thing for a bit. So it seemed kind of new. And I think a lot of it actually just has to do with the voice in the novels, which is very, just sounds like I'm speaking, you know, and I hope that what people took from it and what they continued to take from the books is the authorial voice and the way I speak. I hope anyway. But I think with The Essex Serpent in particular, it was kind of, it just had so many bits that people could take from it.
You've moved more recently to Jonathan Cape. Is that because you were following Hannah Westland, or how did that fit? And then what is the experience of being published by an imprint of a major being like compared to being with a kind of large independent? And again, in the spirit of financial candor that we love on the podcast, you know, how has that changed things as well?
So I just followed Hannah because I'm quite loyal. I don't like change. And there are many things that I prize more than money, and I'm very, very grateful for the financial security that my writing has brought me, but it's not the most important thing. And so I knew that after The Essex Serpent, I could have signed with anybody for an enormous amount of money. And I know this, I could have moved over to any of the big 5 publishers for a massive, massive advance, because it was, you know, that's the kind of book that it was. And you tend to have that moment once in your career, right? You have your breakout book and then you can name your price. And I looked at my agent and I looked at Hannah and I thought, I have a choice here. I can jump ship immediately and leave behind this independent print that has done so much work for me. And more importantly, leave behind the editor that found me when I was 30 and was the one person who loved my work. Leave behind somebody who forces me to be the best possible version of myself for money. Or I could stay with Serpent's Tail and stay with Hannah Westland and continue to build this working relationship where I'm constantly challenged and supported to make my own work. Not to make something commercial, not to make something that will repeat The Essex Serpent, but to make my own work. So I stayed at Serpent's Tail with Hannah for Melmoth, which was absolutely the right thing to do, and obviously had a bigger advance than I did for The Essex Serpent. And then I entered into a 2-book contract with Serpent's Tail for Enlightenment and another book, and then Hannah moved to Jonathan Cape, and I just followed her, and Jonathan Cape bought me out, essentially. And what was really amazing was the support of all my old family at Serpent's Tail, who said, of course, you know, what a wonderful thing. And the experience really has just been the same, because I keep myself very much to what I immediately need to know. I keep myself to the work. I keep myself to the ideas. So I work very closely with Hannah. I work very closely with my agent, and it's the 3 of us together. And I hope that it always will be. So, but I was just very lucky, really, that I had that moment of loyalty to Serpent's Tail and then ended up going to Jonathan Cape anyway without having to abandon my principles. So,
yeah, that's very nice. If we can talk about Melmoth now, it's set in contemporary Prague, tells the story of Helen Franklin, but also this kind of monstrous female figure that kind of stalks people throughout history. Because it ranges across so many time periods and there's many stories nestled within the story, I wondered what your research process was for that novel.
That was a really difficult experience, because I was so unwell, but I'm sort of consumed by the need to write. So I would have to be like basically under general anaesthesia to not be at the very least thinking about a book. And so there were 2 types of research, right? One of them was suffering, which was that I suffered enormously, physical pain. And there's quite a lot of pain in the book and quite a lot of suffering and torment in the book. It's definitely the darkest thing that I've written, and I think with good reason. But I also wanted to write a very political book about individual culpability in the actions of a state, right? So I wanted to write about some 20th century atrocities that are perhaps under-examined. So I wrote about the Armenian genocide in particular, and the persecution of the Sudeten Germans at the end of the Second World War. And it was really interesting. I sat in the National Library of the Czech Republic and read first-person accounts of the Armenian genocide in 1916, and of what happened to the Sudeten Germans. And it was really difficult, and it brought up a lot of ethical questions about how to write trauma and how to write atrocity. How do you do that in a moral way that is truthful to historical fact, but not exploitative, and is unflinching but doesn't invite the reader to be kind of culpable? I don't approve of books where you're kind of like deliciously waiting to find out which fingernail's going to be torn out next. You know, the reader shouldn't enjoy reading about torture. They should be completely kind of wrenched and savaged by it. So yeah, there was a lot of kind of reading things that lingered in my mind for a very long time afterwards, and a lot of walking around Prague, which was nicer.
How did you deal with the linguistic element while reading these first-hand accounts?
Translated. Yeah, they were all translated into English. Which, you know, is a really interesting question, because no translator is totally objective. It's not possible. So you've got, you know, who translated these texts and why and how is a really interesting question. But it was one of those times when I wished that I'd been trilingual at the very least.
To pick up on something else you just said in that answer, you've talked elsewhere about the importance of moral messaging in novels. How do you do that, and how do you suffuse your stories in a way that feels, I suppose, that's authentic to the story, but also not particularly heavy-handed, but also clear?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to like the morals and ethics in novels, I think what is understood, if you see what I mean, is that there is an ethical dimension, there is a life philosophy in every single novel, whether you know you're doing it or not, right? Wherever you go, there you'll be. And the big difference is, are you a novelist who is actually examining yourself as you write and examining what you've written and what it betrays about what you think about women, what you think of minorities, what you think about bodies, what you think about faith? Are you alert and intelligent and reflective enough to understand what you're doing? Or are you just kind of tossing things out there? So the example that I always use is fat phobia in novels, because it's such an easy and obvious thing. If you are somebody who cannot help making every single lazy, stupid character described as being overweight, you have just betrayed your politics, right? You've betrayed what you think of people. Equally, if you're somebody who every time you write a Jewish character, they're betraying some kind of like, I don't know, interest in money or something, you've just betrayed that you're anti-Semitic. So I am somebody who openly says my fiction has a moral dimension and an ethical purpose. I'm somebody who says it. I'm not the only person who does it. All novels do it. And the question is, are you aware that you're doing it? And so I don't try to make my novels instructive. I don't try to make them good. I'm just constantly thinking about goodness, and I'm constantly thinking about ethics. So when I'm writing about state atrocity and individuals, to my mind, you can't just throw that story out there. You need to think very carefully about what you actually think, and that needs to suffuse the text. So you need to think about the possibility of individual redemption or group redemption. What does that look like? What does that mean? Can you be forgiven? Can you elect to be forgiven? And I know that this is something that is quite unpopular. I've been on panels with other writers who say, no, you know, my fiction exists sort of outside of any kind of moral framework. But it doesn't, because it came from them, and they are not, you know, you're yourself, whether you're turning on a tap in the kitchen or whether you're writing a novel, you're still you. And so one of the things that I always say to students or to anyone that attends workshops, you just, wherever you go, there you'll be. You are writing your book, and you will betray yourself in every syllable. So you just have to kind of examine yourself so that you know what you're saying.
What do you think? I mean, looking kind of broadly at the fiction landscape today, a criticism sometimes made is that there can be a kind of didacticism to contemporary fiction, particularly regarding, you know, these points about contemporary tropes. I mean, what is the risk of vis-a-vis morals, of predictability, as it were, of being overly didactic.
Well, readers don't like it, and I think that's one thing that we all have to remember is that readers are really, really smart, and they notice this stuff, and I think the books that have a slightly more kind of sophisticated or inquiring framework are so. If you take Sally Rooney, for example, as the most obvious kind of highly successful contemporary writer, even if it's not for you, you can still see that this is somebody who has a very, very profound and sincere and worked political philosophy, and her books are kind of about that. And people respond to that because they see integrity and thoughtfulness and a kind of integrated mind at work in the fiction, and they enjoy it and they like it. What I think works less well is a kind of thoughtless identitarianism where characters are expected to just exist as representatives of a group, if you see what I mean. So somebody will write a book and they will like to show themselves as having a certain set of kind of political ideals, and then they'll create characters who represent, a disability or a race or a culture, and then they have to be kind of virtuous because then you're showing that you think well of people with limb differences because you have created a character who's a good person with a limb difference. Like, I get it, but actually real thought through benevolent, humane attitudes towards individuals is to treat them all as kind of entirely whole, full human beings outside of that identity. So I can remember when I first was working on Enlightenment, it occurred to me there might be people who wondered why I had a gay main character when I'm in a heterosexual marriage. And I spoke to one of my gay friends and said, in the past I would never have worried about this, but are people going to say, what right does she have? And we were having brunch, and he slammed his hands down on the table and he said, we're human beings, love. And I just remember thinking, this is it. This is what has slightly been lost in some contemporary fiction, is creating characters who just have to act as avatars for their group, that's not a step forward at all. All of them should be sort of written as being like full, round, complex human beings.
Absolutely. I think I saw somewhere that you cite kind of Dickens, Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley as writers who managed to balance kind of a clear political and moral worldview with very entertaining fiction that's very, heavily plotted and gripping. Are there any other authors that you think sit in that camp?
Yeah, Francis Spufford springs immediately to mind. So he's somebody who has this very, very clear sense that his books should be joyful, entertaining, gorgeously written, well-plotted entertainments. But he also has a very, very profound, basically Christian life philosophy, which suffuses his work and makes it kind of incredibly integrated. And also Olivia Butler, I'm so hopeless with names. Amazing African-American female horror and science fiction writer.
Octavia
Butler. Thank you very much. I had the O right and the IA. Her work is so gripping as works of science fiction and fantasy and horror, actually. She is equal to Stephen King in terms of horror, but terribly suffused with kind of righteous indignation about racial politics. And so she is somebody who completely embodies that kind of Dickensian thing. So the contemporary writers, there are many contemporary writers who are doing that, and those are the ones that I think I'm sort of most drawn to.
Brilliant. Well, look, Sarah, we're bang up against our time limit. So thank you for a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation, and wishing you all the best with the new novel and with everything else going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Sarah Perry. Her website is sarahperry.net. Her Instagram is sarah_grace_perry. And Enlightenment is published by Vintage. Attention listeners of Always Take Notes. On Friday the 17th of October, we will be interviewing Michelle Paver at Wimbledon Book Fest in London.
Michelle is the author of the best-selling Wolf Brother series, which has sold more than 3 million copies worldwide. She is also the author of Gods and Warriors, a children's series, as well as several novels for adults.
Go to wimbledonbookfest.org to get your tickets. We hope to see you there. Before we get started with the rest of the outro, we have a patron to thank. Her name is Dana Bateman. She received the 2025 American Literary Review Award in Essays for Deracination or How to Disappear. that interrogates the decision of her Indigenous Sami ancestors to pass for white in the racial climate of 1880s America. Her current project is a hybrid memoir/narrative non-fiction account of growing up on the spinning edge of the vinyl record business during the golden age of rock music. Thank you so much, Dana, for your support, and wishing you all the very best with your projects. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Sarah?
I really enjoyed speaking to her. She's someone we've been wanting to have on the show for a while. I thought she was very frank and very honest about, getting a kind of real job in the civil service, because she needed to support herself while she was building her writing career. I thought she was interesting on her religious upbringing, although I did think a little bit about her saying, it wasn't a cult, because at least from what she told us, it did seem to bear certain hallmarks that were a bit cultish. And I thought her, although I'm ready to stand to be corrected on that, and I thought her ideas about morality in fiction were interesting, although again, I'm not entirely sure I 100% agree with them. What about you, Rachel?
Yeah, I agree. I think it was just a really delightful, open, warm conversation about everything from faith and health to money and success. I think Sarah has a particularly distinctive voice as a writer. I reviewed Melmoth for The Economist when it came out and found it wonderfully creepy. It stayed with me for quite a long time afterwards. And we should note that we recorded this a while back, so we didn't cover her new book, Death of an Ordinary Man, which I've also read. And I found that to be deeply moving and compassionate. So, in short, a great episode. Simon, what have you been up to?
I'm currently in Austria for a magazine assignment that I can't talk about, but I hopefully will be able to talk about in due course. But that's been going well. And I have been reading, or in fact rereading, Mountains of the Mind by Robert Macfarlane, which came out, I have, I think, a first edition. It came out in 2003 when I was doing my A-levels. And it's interesting because I was interested in it because I'm writing a book that's kind of about the mountains and has elements of literature and history and stuff. And it's very good, actually. I went back to it kind of wondering whether it would have stood up. You know that feeling when you go back and reread a book you read a long time ago, but it is genuinely very good and very thoughtful and very moving. So it's kind of pleasing to go back to a book that stands up. Anyway, what about you, Rachel? What have you been up to?
I'm pleased to hear it. I have been rereading our shortlisted books for the Baillie Gifford Prize. So we have 6. And then in a few weeks, we're going to be choosing the winner. So that's exciting. And other than that, just editing various Strolly pieces. And when I'm not doing that, watching The Summer I Turned Pretty, which I'm nearly done with. I've loved it. So yeah, I'm looking for my next switch off TV show after that.
Very good. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on X at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.